Hello my beautiful watchers and welcome to Lost in Adaptation, the review show dedicated to discussing how screen adaptations of literature tie into said literature. Today we're delving into Sense and Sensibility, published in 1811 by legendary English author Jane Austen, or as I like to call it, wait, I thought you guys were engaged, the novel. Whether or not Sense and Sensibility was the first book that Jane Austen wrote is debated, but it's definitely the first novel that she published. That said, at the time of publication, her name wasn't on the book as, during her lifetime, Ms. Austen hid behind the extremely non-specific pseudonym A Lady, partly to avoid the social stigma of being a woman and having a profession. Ooh. Like most of her work, the focus revolves around the troubled love lives of the English gentry, and how often said love lives revolve around financial considerations, impressively making it simultaneously a celebration and cutting critique of British upper-class culture. In this case, the love lives belong to Eleanor and Marianne Dashwood, young sisters who suddenly find themselves in a new home after an inconvenient impoverishment at the start of the story, and the gentleman they meet as a result. I personally think Austen's relative inexperience shows in this book. She's still one of the most talented writers to ever live, but it just fails to grip me in the same way her later works did. Though I guess it is fun to see proto-forms of things that would make successors like Pride and Prejudice so endearing, like the plot twist that the charming, handsome man you'd assume was the hero is actually a complete dick, while the difficult-to-like-at-first guy has a heart of gold. There tends to be quite a range of options when it comes to adaptations of Jane Austen's books, as people have been trying to bring them to screen for almost 60 years now. By request of the extremely patient patron who commissioned me to make this video like 5 years ago. This is a competitive episode of Lost in Adaptation between two of the most popular of these attempts, the 1995 film adaptation versus the 2008 BBC TV miniseries. So, let's meet the contestants. The 1995 film is very much the passion baby of producer Lindsay Doran and writer Emma Thompson, who apparently didn't originally intend to also star in it as Eleanor, but ended up hitting peak fame during the 5 years of development, so became too valuable a draw to pass up on. The entire cast of this one is a 90s kid's wet dream, to be completely honest. A baby-faced Kate Winslet took the role of younger sister Marianne, equally baby-faced Hugh Grant and Greg Wise as the girl's love interests, along with regular-faced Alan Rickman, because that legend apparently looked like he was in his 40s for about 40 years. Taiwanese director Ang Lee was eventually chosen to direct. He apparently wasn't super familiar with Jane Austen's work in particular, but had made several films that depicted complex familial dynamics in a social comedy setting, an experience that Doran and Thompson felt would fit this story perfectly. Random fun fact, Thompson once told a fun story about the time that a catastrophic computer meltdown almost destroyed the only copy of the script, but was saved by the amateur data retrieval nerd skills of her friend Stephen Fry, while she hung out with his old college roommate Hugh Laurie. That has to have been the most star-studded and, I don't know, most British tech support visit in history. About 10 years later, the BBC decided they wanted their own Sense and Sensibility, with blackjack and hookers. Actually, there's a tiny element of truth to that Futurama quote. The intention was apparently to make a slightly more modern, sexy interpretation of a Jane Austen story. In an unusual display of good sense for them, they rehired Andrew Davies, the writer behind the immensely popular 1995 adaptation of Pride and Prejudice that gifted the world the iconic Colin Firth wet t-shirt competition scene. Davies would eventually admit that surpassing the 1995 film as the best Sense and Sensibility adaptation was a driving force for his writing, which I kind of approve of. A little bit of shameless but good-natured pettiness is a perfectly acceptable motivator. The lead roles eventually went to Hattie Morahan, Charity Wakefield, Dan Stevens, David Morrissey, and Dominic Cooper. Filming took place on location in various places in England, and you can absolutely tell because every scene looks cold, damp, windy, and depressing. I will freely admit that this is absolutely accurate to the average British summer in real life. The near-constant sunshine in Bridgerton required more suspension of disbelief than the Black Queen, but I don't know, am I being shallow for saying it's just kind of unpleasant to watch? Everything's kind of dark and washed out looking as a result. There also does not appear to be any surviving high-definition copies of this miniseries. I tried buying or renting it from at least 3 different sources, and it looked like absolute ass every time. One assumes nicer copies used to exist because the series was well received and it eventually broadcast in 2008, enjoying high ratings and positive reviews from critics. So, both adaptations were pretty popular in their time, which should keep things interesting. Let's see if they did that by being loyal to the book or by trying to improve on it. Both versions do an undeniably solid job of recreating most of the plot beats of the book. Both start with the death of Henry Dashwood, who uses his last breath to entreat his son John to look after his half-sisters Eleanor and Marianne, as his estate is legally bound in such a way that he can't leave anything to them directly. They then both successfully recreate the little comedic scene in which John's arsehole greedy wife negotiates him down, step by step, from a generous financial contribution through a small stipend, past regular gifts to eventually land on maybe helping them move out of the house that they're taking from them. Probably should stop saying both at the start of every sentence. The following is what both adaptations got right. The girl's widowed mother being quickly driven to despair by her stepchildren's overbearing presence, so jumping at the opportunity to leave when a rich cousin of hers offers them a small cottage on his land. Greedy McMeany in-law's brother Edward coming to visit and being immediately very taken with Eleanor, who reciprocates despite Marianne's insistence that he's kind of dull and monotone. Because, you know, he's the sense option and Marianne's the one with the boner for sensibility. The cottage being somewhat underwhelming compared to their previous address, and their relatives, Sir John and his family, being affable to the point of possibly being a bit much. A friend of Sir John's, Colonel Brandon, visiting and becoming instantly smitten with Marianne, though it's not reciprocated in the same way this time. Marianne injuring her ankle while out for an ill-advised walk in the rain, and being rescued by a dashing, charismatic young man called Willoughby, who carries her home and proves to be all the sensibility that she could ever want. A young lady called Lucy Steele visiting and confiding in Eleanor that she and Edward have been secretly engaged for years in a thinly veiled attempt to scare off her romantic rival. This obviously upsets Eleanor because everyone, including her, had been low-key assuming that she and Edward were engaged. A rather depressed Colonel Brandon inquiring if Willoughby and Marianne are engaged, which Eleanor tentatively confirms, but that proving to be premature as, after a long unexpected absence, they are snubbed by Willoughby at a party, and Marianne gets a rather cold letter that attempts to gaslight her into believing that nothing was ever going on with them. News of Lucy and Edward's secret engagement making it to Edward's mother, who demands he break it off, and after he refuses on general principle, disinheriting him in favour of his little brother. The kind-hearted Colonel Brandon offering Edward a job so he's not totally destitute. Marianne falling deathly ill, but pulling through and accepting Colonel Brandon's marriage proposal as he's grown on her considerably despite the large age gap and only average sensibility levels. Eleanor getting the news that Lucy is now married, but it turning out that she actually jilted Edward for his now very rich little brother, which Edward is completely fine with as he's now off the marriage hook dishonour-free and can confess his love for Eleanor, who accepts his proposal. The ends. There's a few classic adaptation differences that plague both versions equally. For example, with access to Eleanor's inner thoughts, you know that she immediately summarizes that Edward's engagement to Lucy Steele was the result of a rash impulse that he had had as a teenager, but wasn't able to break it off due to his honourable nature, despite having ceased to care for her long ago. The big will they won't they question was not, as the adaptations portrayed it, does Edward love Lucy or Eleanor, but would there ever be a way for Edward to back out of his commitment? So, you would think that having almost twice the runtime than the movie would give the TV show a huge edge regarding what scenes from the book were represented, but this advantage was largely negated by the film's good pacing and careful selection of what scenes were included, which left no massive obvious gaps in the story. The 2008 version ended up using most of its extra time showing on screen several things that were only described verbally post hoc in the book, like Colonel Brandon and Willoughby's duel of honour and Edward's mother's rejected ultimatum. So, with no clear winner for the story in general, perhaps we need to take a closer look at the interpretations of the individual characters. Regarding the pivotal sisters, both adaptations once again remain fairly faithful to the book, the only big exception to this being their ages in the film, as Marianne is bumped up from age 16 to 19, and Eleanor jumps all the way up from 19 to 27. This was evidently to make the role more suitable for 35-year-old Emma Thompson, who Lindsay Dornan was determined to cast for her name recognition and suitability for the character in almost every other way. They also mentioned wanting to make the story more relatable to a modern audience, though if that was the goal, I would have thought the more important person to significantly age up would be Marianne, considering she eventually marries a 35-year-old. who looks even older in the film. Okay, so to talk about Edward, I need to go on a bit of a tangent. Well, I don't have to, but I'm fucking doing it. One of the main themes of the book, in fact the very one from which it derives its title, is the question of what makes for a better partner. A person of sense but limited excitement, or a person of sensibility but limited reliability. Unlike with Pride and Prejudice, which also incorporated similar themes regarding what values one should look for in a husband, but in which Austen very carefully and cleverly remained even-handed with the results, and was equally even in dividing the blame for the title nouns between the lead characters, in the sense versus sensibility debate, she appears to have picked a side, and that side was definitely sense. Eleanor ends up with sense man Edward, but Marianne gets nothing but hardship from sensibility Willoughby, and ends up with Colonel Brandon, who I don't think is a direct representation of either, but definitely falls more on the sense side of things. In fact, journalist and biographer Claire Tomalin claims there's evidence in the way the book is structured to suggest that Austen changed her mind about which S word she favoured as she was writing it. Anyways, this finally leads me to my point and an issue I have with both of these adaptations, as evidently neither of them could resist the temptation to make Edward more handsome and charming, despite the fact that being the milkiest of milk toast people was supposed to be, you know, his whole thing. Edward is sensible. He likes things, but he's not openly passionate about them, and can come off as quite monotone and, you know, dull as fuck to almost everyone, but for whatever reason, Eleanor's really into it. I think the 2008 version has to have been influenced by the 1995 film here, because, I mean, just look at this guy. They have to have made an effort to find a Hugh Grant knockoff to play him. Baby blue eyes like that aren't super common, and both versions of the character impress Eleanor by bonding with her younger sister Margaret. I hadn't mentioned Margaret until now because I've read this book twice and utterly forgotten she was in it both times. She adds basically nothing to the plot. 2008 appears to have completely forgotten that Edward's supposed to come off as dull. Marianne's complaints seem to come out of nowhere in this version as they follow a montage of him actively doing a bunch of things. Whether or not this represents an improvement on the story is up for debate. Austen intentionally wrote Book Edward to not make much of an impact on the reader, and as a result, he doesn't make much of an impact on the reader, and it's harder to be upset when Eleanor's relationship with him is in dire peril. The charm that these actors bring to the role increases the audience investment, but at the cost of making the title make less sense. Do you see what I did there? Anyways, both Willoughbys succeed in coming off as genuine at first, making the sudden turnaround sufficiently jarring for the audience as well as Marianne. A big difference, however, is in the movie, Willoughby doesn't get his final scene, in which, driven mad by guilt by the news that Marianne might be fatally ill, confesses to Eleanor that the mean letter was a lie, and he did have feelings for her sister, and the decision to dump her so he could marry someone else for her money was a very hard one. He had been forced to write his missive denying ever having felt anything for her by his controlling fiancé, who had read his mail and found out he'd been flirting, which, while not absolving him of guilt, does help explain the sudden cruelty. He also tries to justify or at least acknowledge regret over his treatment of Colonel Brandon's adopted daughter. All of this is completely absent in the 1995 version, in which his sadness over losing Marianne was only hinted at in dialogue between the sisters and a mournful look at her wedding before buggering off. The TV show does include this scene and his excuses, though compared to her book predecessor, I'd say that Eleanor is less sympathetic at the end of it, which is fair. It was an exceptional act of compassion in the book that would have been difficult to translate to film without Eleanor's inner dialogue. Colonel Brandon is, by design, a bit of a disinteresting character until the reveal of his sad backstory regarding the girl that he was in love with, who was briefly married to his brother but eventually died a homeless sex worker, leaving him with nothing but a child to look after. Part of said backstory is revealed a little early in the film, presumably to make him more interesting sooner. Interestingly, I felt like both adaptations somewhat played down the way that the entire town assumed that his ward, Eliza, was his bastard child, even though the TV show actually saves some runtime for Eliza, opening on Willoughby, though his identity is somewhat hidden, promising that he would return to her soon before running away from her pregnant arse and never looking back. The narrative returns to her occasionally, including her getting the news that he'd officially married someone else. The TV show also leans into making the, for want of a less dramatic word, bad guys as much of a hate sink as possible, with particular emphasis on Fanny, the stingy sister-in-law, and Lucy, the gold-digging love rival. I mean, yes, they were both arseholes in the book, but the show really plays up the infuriating mannerisms and passive-aggressive comments to the point where you are absolutely rooting for one of them to get kicked over the horizon by a startled carriage horse. The film went with slightly more chill versions of these characters, which I think is probably slightly more in keeping with the book. A few friends of the family who don't super contribute to the plot are completely left out, and the film cut Lucy's good-natured but stupid sister, Anne Steele, who was supposed to spill the beans about her sister's engagement to Edward. Her role is mostly just absorbed into Lucy, making the slightly inexplicable decision to out her own secret with surprisingly violent results. Final thoughts. You know, this might be a weird, unsatisfying conclusion, but I think it's a Pyrrhic victory for the TV show. The 2008 version is a more book-accurate adaptation of Sense and Sensibility, but you should probably still watch the film instead. Bringing the Willoughby character arc to its conclusion is probably the single biggest win over the 1995 film, and matching detail for detail, it probably comes out ahead 9 times out of 10. And when there were deviations from the book in the TV show, the film usually ended up making the same decisions. But the thing is, the film comes in a close enough second place that if I were recommending one or the other to a Jane Austen fan, I would probably still side with it so that they could enjoy the higher budget, less depressing colour palette, and most importantly, the cast. Not that there is anything wrong with the performances of the 2008 actors, and they were on the whole better fits for the roles, it's just you can't put Emma Thompson, Keira Knightley, Hugh Grant, and Alan Rickman in a film together and not expect me to simp for each and every one of them. So yeah, maybe I'm just being less precious about what they changed because I think this is one of Austen's weaker books, but I think that the book accuracy that you miss out on in the film is worth it for the more enjoyable watching experience. I am aware that this is pretty far from being an unbiased review even by my standards, so if you think you can change your mind, you're welcome to try in the comments, or if you just want to tell me that I'm correct and handsome, I would also enjoy that. Thank you for joining me, my beautiful watchers, and an extra special thank you to my patrons who have never once complained about my horrifyingly slow turnaround time. Not one of them in 10 years of me being criminally slow with redeeming requests has anyone ever complained. You know, just wow. I love you guys, and I will try to get the requests out quicker from now on, I swear. Partly to avoid the social stigma. I just heard a meow coming from inside the closet that I closed like 30 minutes ago. I didn't realize Wisp was in there when I closed it. I'm sorry, BB. I didn't mean to trap you in there. I'm sorry. Oh no. I'm a monster. Blah blah blah. Blah blah blah. Blah blah blah. Glad we could clear that up.